This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can pre-order all the cards you see in this video by using my link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nissa, and today I'm continuing with my March of the Machine limited set review. So far I've looked at the multicolored, colorless white and blue cards, and today we're continuing with black. For every card I'll discuss how I think it will play in limited, and I'll sum up my thoughts by using a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews, you can find out what my grades mean by looking in the description. A couple of things to keep in mind as we look at these cards. First, I'm only evaluating these for play in limited and not any other formats, and that means only cards that appear in draft boosters are in this video. Also, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, so I of course won't be right about everything. I will be providing updates about the format here on the channel as I play it more and more. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, let's take a look at the first black card, which is Aetherblade Agent, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 human rogue at common with Death Touch, and you can pay 4 generic and a blue Phyrexian mana, which means you can pay blue or 2 life, and transform Aetherblade Agent. It becomes Gitaxian Mind Stinger, a 3/3 Phyrexian rogue with Death Touch, and when it deals combat damage to a player or battle, you draw a card. A 2-mana 1/1 with Death Touch is definitely a little bit below rate. It's like a C-, but it does trade for anything, and the creature this can become late is a pretty big problem for your opponent on most board states. It goes from simply being able to trade for everything to being something that they really have to block, and there's not really going to be very good choices for them to block it effectively. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Archpriest of Shadows, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 human warlock at rare. It's got backup 1. This is a new mechanic in the set. It says, when this creature enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. If that's another creature, it gains the following abilities until end of turn. Those abilities include Death Touch, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or battle, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. So your choices here are either that you get a 5-mana 5/5 with these abilities, or a 5-mana 4/4 that has these abilities, but also lends them to something else and gives something else a counter when it enters the battlefield. Having this come down and give these abilities to something that can attack right away is amazing, especially if your opponent just doesn't have good blocks in any way, especially once you give a creature Death Touch. But they kind of have to block it if you have any creatures at all in your graveyard, because if they don't, you end up getting back a creature, which is a really big deal. So it really puts them in a pick your poison scenario the turn it comes down, and then on the next turn, the Archpriest itself can attack and also cause the same problem. Overall, I think that makes this a very good card. I'm giving it a B+. Next, it's Ayara, Widow of the Realm, which costs 1 generic and 2 black for a 3/3 legendary elf noble at rare. You can tap it and sacrifice another creature or artifact, and Ayara, Widow of the Realm deals X damage to target opponent or battle, and you gain X life, where X is a sacrifice permanent's mana value, and you can pay 5 generic and a red Phyrexian mana to transform her. Then she becomes Ayara Furnace Queen, a 4/4 Phyrexian elf noble, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, return up to 1 target artifact or creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. Ayara's front side is already a really strong card. You know, it's a 3-mana 3/3, which is a decent enough rate, and giving up creatures or artifacts to drain the opponent's life is a great way to close out a game. There will be situations where you can't take full advantage of that ability, but the baseline is still a 3-mana 3/3, and black-red actually has a lot of good sacrifice fodder. And once you transform her, you can start getting back the things that she might have sacrificed earlier every turn. I mean, you only get it temporarily, of course, but that's still pretty good. And sometimes you won't really be able to use the front ability because you don't have anything on board to sacrifice. And if you have the time to transform her in that situation, that's going to be a lot better because at least you can bring things back to pressure your opponent. Her ability to bring things back also works really well with other sacrifice outlets. Overall, this looks quite good to me. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Bladed Battle Fan, which for 1 generic and a black is a common artifact equipment with flash. When it enters the battlefield, attach it to target creature you control. That creature gains indestructible until end of turn. Equipped creature gets +1/+0, and it has equip for 1 generic. This seems solid. +1/+0 and Indestructible isn't a terrible trick-like effect because it saves a creature in combat while also helping them punch up, and it saves the creature from most removal too. Anytime a card can do both of those things, they end up seeing play. The equipment itself definitely isn't exciting after the turn you cast it, and that does make it awkward in some situations, but the threat this presents as a trick is nice, and it's flexible too. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Blight Reaper Thallid, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 fungus at uncommon, and you can pay 3 generic and a green Phyrexian mana to transform it, at which point it becomes Blight Sower Thallid, which is a 3/3 Phyrexian fungus, and when it transforms or dies, you create a 1/1 green Phyrexian Saproling creature token. You get a 2/2 up front, and then on the next turn, you have the option of making this a 3/3 and getting a 1/1. That's a pretty nice thing to have around if you don't have anything to do with 3 mana, and at some point you're certainly going to have the time to transform this. It isn't the most massive upgrade ever, but you do end up getting 2 Saplings and a 3/3 in the long run, and that's pretty good. I'm giving this a B-. This seems like a 2-drop with really good upside. Next up, it's Bloated Processor, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 Phyrexian at rare. You can sacrifice another Phyrexian to put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when it dies, you incubate X, where X is its power. This is a new mechanic. It says, create an incubator token with X +1/+1 counters on it, and 2 generic, transform this artifact. It transforms into a 0/0 Phyrexian artifact creature. Notably, this is a free sacrifice ability, and those always play really impressively in Limited. It makes it a real pain to ever know what's going to happen when this is on the battlefield. Now, it does restrict the effect to only Phyrexians, but if you're in Black-White especially, that will be most of your creatures, and even outside of Black-White, there are a lot of Phyrexians in the set. Not quite as many as we saw in the Brothers' War, but there are a lot of them. It can gobble up the plentiful incubator tokens too, though they do already need to be transformed, but setting all that Phyrexian stuff aside, we're still talking about a 3 mana 3/2 that incubates 3 when it dies if you don't do anything else at all with it, and that would be a very good card that always makes the cut, and this has this extra big upside of being able to sacrifice things and gain counters, and I think the whole package makes this a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Breach the Multiverse, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery. Each player mills 10 cards. For each player, choose a creature or planeswalker in that player's graveyard, put those cards onto the battlefield under your control, then each creature you control becomes a Phyrexian in addition to its other types. 7 mana to reanimate the best things in your graveyard and your opponent's graveyard isn't too bad. Because it mills 10 cards, you are reasonably likely to get back at least 7 mana worth of value, and the card selection you get should be pretty powerful. One kind of cool thing about this is if the game is really late and both players are low enough on cards that this eliminates both decks, you can also cast this to mill your opponent out, and they will draw before you do. The fact it makes everything into a Phyrexian really matters in the Black-White deck especially too, because it has a bunch of tribal payoffs for that creature type. This is expensive for sure, but this is going to be very capable of pulling you ahead from behind in most situations, and I think that makes it a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. Next, it's Collective Nightmare, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon instant with Convoke. This is a returning mechanic, and it says your creatures can help cast this spell. Each creature you tap while casting this spell pays for 1 generic or 1 mana of that creature's color. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. Even without Convoke, this is a very good removal spell. With Convoke, it's really crazy. As I've said about some of these other Convoke cards, this is something you're going to have to keep in mind even when your opponent is completely tapped out. If they're playing black and they have 3 or more creatures untapped, they can still play this to interact and really mess with you. And that's something you really have to keep in mind in this format because of all the instants with Convoke, which I don't think is an amazing design, if I'm being honest, but you know, just evaluating this card based on how good it's going to be in Limited, it's going to be really good. It's very easily premium removal. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Completed Huntmaster, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 Phyrexian Elf Warrior at uncommon. You pay 1 and tap it, and you can sack another creature or artifact and incubate 3. This is a nice sacrifice outlet as it does allow you to hold on to a body in play. You can sort of look at this as paying 3 mana and sacrificing something to get a 3/3. That wouldn't be a bad deal, and this is better because you can pay for the incubator on a separate turn. This doesn't have the worst stats for a card with this strong of an ability either. Cards like this really make me feel like the sacrifice deck in this format is going to have some legs. There are just a lot of really good sacrifice outlets at common and uncommon, as well as good sacrifice fodder. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Consuming Etherborn, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/2 Etherborn vampire at common. It's got backup 1 and lifelink. Giving a counter and lifelink until end of turn to something when this enters the battlefield isn't too bad, but a 4 mana 3/3 with lifelink is definitely not a good deal, and it sort of feels like both options are a little overcosted. I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Corrupted Conviction, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, and you draw 2 cards. If you have expendable creatures, this is pretty good, and it always has the mode of allowing you to use it after you block, or if your creature is targeted with removal. But if you're only using it in those situations, it gets worse than it would be in a deck with good sacrifice fodder because it becomes really narrow. Ideally, you also consistently have bodies around you can sacrifice and feel good about it, which means this can be used in a much wider variety of situations. It is a bit of a bummer that it can't sacrifice artifacts too. Most of these sacrifice things in this set say artifacts or creatures, but they probably didn't want to make this too good in Constructed, where treasure is everywhere and it's very easy to get insane value with a card like this. Either way, I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Deadly Derision, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common instant. It says destroy target creature or planeswalker, create a treasure token. We've seen this card at sorcery speed before, and it was pretty good. As an instant, it gets significantly better. This is easily premium removal and pretty much a lock to be one of black's best commons, if not the best. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Dreg Recycler, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian Beast at common, and you can tap it and sacrifice an artifact or a creature, and each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this is another nice, cheap sacrifice outlet, and another one that I think is pretty high quality. Life Drain does a good job of helping you stay alive while also pressuring your opponent, and this even has passable stats. I'm giving it a C+. Next, it's Etched Familiar, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 Phyrexian Fox at common. It's an artifact creature, and when it dies, each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. This looks nice. Trading this off and draining 2 life from your opponent is going to feel like a good deal all the time, and it isn't terrible sacrifice fodder either. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Etched Host Doombringer, which for 4 generic and a black is a 3/5 Phyrexian Demon at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose 1. Target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. We've seen a lot of life drain all in a row here. But the other option is choose target battle. If an opponent protects it, remove 3 defense counters from it. Otherwise, put 3 defense counters on it. This is a neat design. Obviously, the stats aren't very good, but even if this could only drain 2 life on entering the battlefield, if that was the only option you had, it would probably be playable, so this battle upside is pretty nice. If you can use this to defeat a battle and transform it, and some of them do start with 3 defense, so you may not have even had to attack it. Most of them start with around 5, so if you've gotten it down a little bit and then you can play this and defeat the battle, that feels pretty good too. But either way, if it can come down and defeat a battle with that trigger, it's going to pretty much feel like you're getting a 2-for-1. And the fact you can also use it to add counters to battles your opponent is trying to attack is nice too. I think this looks pretty good for a common. I'm giving it a C+. This is an interesting card, and it's going to be a nice litmus test for just how good battles are in the format to some extent, and how big of a part of the format they are, because I can see a world where this ends up being a very, very good common if it turns out you can very consistently defeat a battle with this when it enters the battlefield. But if battles end up being more underwhelming than I'm expecting, then it probably goes down to a more mediocre card. Next up, it's Failed Conversion, which for 4 generic and a black is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets -4/-4, and when that creature dies, you surveil 2. This isn't the worst rate ever. Against most creatures, it's going to feel like a 5-mana sorcery that kills a creature and then you surveil 2. But it also isn't premium. If I'm paying 5 mana for a removal spell that is only sorcery speed, it should probably be capable of killing more things. And sure, you can put this on something to weaken it significantly, but this is a lot of mana for a removal spell that won't always kill what you put it on. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Final Flourish, which for 1 generic and a black is a common instant with Kicker. Sacrifice an artifact or a creature. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. If this spell was kicked, that creature gets -6/-6 until end of turn instead. This is a nice removal spell. The base card is about a C. It's not that efficient, but it can deal with a lot of creatures, including creatures that cost more than it does. But if you pay the Kicker, this is going to end up being capable of killing pretty much everything for only 2 mana. That said, I don't quite think this is premium removal, mostly because actually being able to kick it all the time just isn't how things work out, even if you're in like a black-red sacrifice deck. And when you can't kick it, or kicking it is really inefficient for you, where you have to like straight up 2-for-1 yourself, it's really not going to feel very good. And those situations will come up some of the time. So I think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Flitting Gorilla, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 fairy rogue. At common, it's got flying. And when it dies, each player mills 2 cards, and you may exile Flitting Gorilla. When you do, put target creature or battle card from your graveyard on top of your library. So this starts out with Windrake stats, which aren't amazing these days, but it is kind of passable when a card has a bunch of other text, and this does. The fact that it mills 2 cards for both players when it dies is going to be pretty nice for the blue-black deck, and the card's additional effect will come up sometimes. You know, if you have a really good battle or creature in your graveyard, you're going to want to be able to put that card back on top of your library. There are going to be a lot of times where it's just not worth doing, or you don't even have anything to put on top of your library anyway, even with the mill effect. So I don't think this is amazing. And remember, putting a card on top of your library isn't the same, or anywhere close to the same, as returning a card to your hand, because that would make this a 2-for-1. As it is, it's a 1-for-1 that's kind of inefficient, that gives you a little bit of card selection when it dies. So I think it's just a C. Next, it's Gift of Completion, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you incubate 3, and when a Phyrexian you control dies, you surveil 1. You can look at this as a 4-mana 3/3 with this static surveil ability, and it's better than that because you can pay in installments, and the surveil effect sticks around even if the creature you get from it dies. If your deck has a lot of Phyrexians in it, this is going to really give you some great card selection. And this is still basically a Hell Giant with some pretty real upside. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Glistening Deluge, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery. All creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. Creatures that are green and or white get an additional -2/-2 until end of turn. This card design really annoys me, mostly because it ends up being even more narrow than the other cards in this cycle. This is because it has a symmetrical effect, unlike the others. So that means if you're playing black-white or black-green, you really don't want to play this or side it in, which makes it an even more narrow card, as I said. The other cards in the cycle don't care if you're playing the color this card hates on. They don't hurt you at all, but this one does, and I don't think that's amazing. That said, if you're in one of the other 3 black decks, it is a really powerful sideboard card that might sometimes be pretty close to a one-sided Wrath, but the base effect is underpowered enough that this should probably start in your sideboard. It's probably an F in your main deck, but probably like a B- if you're in one of those non-green, non-white black decks and you're going up against a deck that is one or both of those colors, because this does do some serious damage to the board. Next up, it's Gloomfang Mauler, which for 5 generic and 2 black is a 5/5 nightmare at common. It's got swamp cycling for 2, which means you can pay 2 generic and discard it to search up a swamp and put it into your hand. It has backup 2, and it has menace. As we've already seen, from the first few videos, I really like land cycling. Every time we see cycling or land cycling, it does offer a pretty real upgrade to a card. And when you actually cast this thing, it does have a huge impact on the board. It either comes down as an absolutely monstrous 7/7 with menace, or it comes down as a 5/5 that gives something else 2 counters as well as menace until end of turn. So this gives it the ability to immediately impact the board when it comes down. And that's usually going to be the better option with most cards that have backup, because if your opponent does just kill this with a removal spell, you don't get anything out of it. Whereas if you put the counters somewhere else, give something else menace, there's also a good chance it can attack right away. The downside, of course, is that this does cost 7 mana, and you don't always get there in limited, but this helps you get around that downside by having swamp cycling, which means if you draw this early and you really need to hit a land drop, this can do it for you. And that gives it a nice mode in the early game and a pretty powerful mode in the later stages. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Grafted Butcher, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 Phyrexian Samurai at rare. When it enters the battlefield, Phyrexians you control gain menace until end of turn. Other Phyrexians you control get +1/+1. You can also pay 3 generic and a black and sacrifice an artifact or creature to return it from your graveyard to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. There are a lot of Phyrexians in this set, including all the Incubate tokens. We've also seen that black-white is a deck that's really about Phyrexian Tribal, so that's where this can really shine, but it's going to be good in most black decks. Offering +1/+1 and 1 turn of menace to your Phyrexians when this enters the battlefield Does mean it's going to have a huge impact on mini boards. I mean, sometimes you'll have to run it out on turn 2 and it won't really do anything. But the upside there is you can just bring it back later and get it to do its enter the battlefield ability and buff your whole board again. So it doesn't stay dead. It makes all of your Phyrexians a lot scarier. And I think the whole package is a pretty strong card. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Hoarding Broodlord, which costs 5 generic and 3 black for a 7/6 dragon at rare. It's got Convoke. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a card, exile it face down, and then shuffle. For as long as that card remains exiled, you may play it. Spells you cast from exile have Convoke. This looks really good. Getting it down to 6 or so mana isn't a stretch. And once you're doing that, you're getting a very efficient flying threat that also searches up your best card and lets you cast that card with Convoke. The great thing is, even if your opponent kills this, you get to hold on to that card. Obviously, you can't cast it with Convoke, but you can still cast it from exile. So this is always going to give you a 2-for-1, and if your opponent doesn't kill it, they're going to have to contend with both the Broodlord and whatever the next best card in your deck is, and that makes it a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Ichor Drinker, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 creature Phyrexian vampire common with lifelink. You can pay 1 black and exile it from your graveyard to Incubate 2, activate only as a sorcery. This 1-drop brings a lot of value. A 1-mana 1/1 with lifelink isn't amazing, but in a format with +1/+1 counters around, among other ways to augment your creatures, it probably will play better than it looks. Additionally, if you mill this thing in your blue-black deck, or it ends up in your graveyard in any other way, it does deliver some real value in the form of the Incubate token, which both black-white and black-green are pretty interested in. This is another one of these 1-drops lately that I feel like is going to play quite well because it's so cheap and it does so much for so many different decks in the format. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Ichor Shade, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 Phyrexian Shade at common. At the beginning of your end step, if an artifact or creature was put into a graveyard from the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on Ichor Shade. It's nice that this looks at both graveyards, as sometimes when we see this sort of effect, it only checks yours. This will gain a counter on a significant number of turns, especially if you're a sacrifice deck. It does have a bad baseline, but you can definitely hold on to this and play it in a second main phase after something dies, and it will quickly become a 3/4, and it can kind of go crazy from there. I'm giving this a C+. Alright, it's time for the battles. Our first black one is Invasion of Eldraine, which for 3 generic and a black is an uncommon battle siege. As a siege enters, choose an opponent to protect it. You and others can attack it. When it's defeated, exile it, then cast it transformed. It starts with 4 defense, and the way you defeat these is by attacking them. For each damage that this takes, you remove one of those defense counters, and then it gets defeated, which will allow you to cast the other side. And when this enters a battlefield, target opponent discards 2 cards. When you defeat it, you can cast Prickle Fairies, a 2/2 flyer that says, at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, if that player has 2 or fewer cards in hand, it deals 2 damage to them. I don't love that the front side of this is an overcosted Mind Rot. It'll feel nice if you play it early and you get that 2-for-1, but not adding to the board is definitely a problem, as is how bad this is as a top deck in many situations. It does synergize with itself, because once transformed, it punishes the opponent for having too few cards in hand. Still, I don't see the front side delivering enough value or assisting enough in transforming it that I think this is going to be great. Obviously, if you always got the creature and the effect for 4 mana, it would be nuts, but I don't think you can accomplish that consistently enough here. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Invasion of Fiora, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a rare battle siege. It starts with 4 defense, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one or both. Destroy all legendary creatures, or destroy all non-legendary creatures. Once defeated, you can cast Marchesa, Resolute Monarch, a 3/6 legendary human noble with menace and death touch, and when she attacks, you remove all counters from up to 1 target permanent, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you haven't been dealt combat damage since your last turn, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. A 6-mana Modal Wrath is quite nice, especially because you'll be able to choose an option that works the best for you sometimes. In other words, if you have 1 legendary creature that can survive this and your opponent doesn't have any, or your opponent's only untapped creature is a legendary creature, you can choose the option that works the most effectively for you to get Marchesa the most quickly. Sometimes you will just nuke the entire board, and then your chances of attacking this and transforming it might be a little sketchy, because usually when that happens, you're just in top deck mode. But you do still have some value that's left on the table after the dust clears that can potentially allow you to get a card, and that certainly matters. And obviously, once she transforms, she's pretty insane. She can defeat a battle just by attacking, and she draws you a bunch of cards. So yeah, overall, I do think this is a bomb. It can utterly reshape the board. There aren't many cards that can have this big of an impact on the game. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Invasion of Innistrad, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare battle siege. Starts with 5 defense, it has flash, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -13/-13 until end of turn. When defeated, it gets cast as Deluge of the Dead. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2/2/2 black zombie creature tokens, and you can pay 2 generic and a black to exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you make a 2/2 black zombie creature token. It's an enchantment also. So this one's really good. This might be the best battle in the set for limited. It's definitely in contention. It's a great removal spell, and the fact it has flash works really well with how battles work. Your opponent is going to have no idea this is coming, so you're likely to produce a situation where they aren't prepared to defend it, especially because you're going to kill whatever their best creature is. That means flashing this in at the end of your opponent's turn, killing something, gives you a very good chance of just being able to attack this right away. And if you have any board state at all, there's a pretty good chance you're going to transform it in a single attack and suddenly get these zombies. In other words, this is going to feel like you're paying 4 mana to kill your opponent's best thing and get 2/2/2 zombies and this permanent enchantment that can crank out more zombies. And that efficiency is pretty crazy. And even if you're not able to attack it, and you won't always be able to, even when you kill their best thing and you can flash this in, you're still talking about a premium removal spell that you would play in your deck all the time anyway. So I think the whole package here is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next, it's Invasion of Olgratha, which for 4 generic and a black is an uncommon battle siege with 5 starting defense. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. It can't hit itself. It actually says any other target, which does matter. It would be kind of interesting if it could damage itself. Anyway, once defeated, it transforms into Grandmother Ravi Singer, a 3/3 legendary human wizard with flying. And whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on her, and you gain 1 life. 5 mana to do 3 to anything and gain 3 is a C-level card. So, like most of the battles, this has a decent enough baseline. Sometimes you'll be able to cast it and defeat another battle, which is going to feel pretty good. Sometimes you just lightning helix your opponent in the face, and sometimes you'll just kill one of their creatures. All of those modes are pretty nice. And then when you transform this, you do get a fairly imposing creature, though on some boards she's not going to feel completely insane. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Merciless Repurposing, which for 4 generic and 2 black is an uncommon instant. It says exile target creature, incubate 3. 6 mana is a lot, even for instant speed removal that can exile any creature, mostly because you end up paying more than your opponent did for their creature a lot of the time. You know, if you've played a lot of limited and you've played expensive removal spells, you've had that horrible feeling where your opponent plays some 3-drop you really need to kill, and you look at your hand and this is the only way you have to kill something, and that can often be a huge problem. And even when you do cast it to kill that thing, it doesn't feel good most of the time because you spend so much more mana than they did. This tries to make up for that, and it does to some extent by incubating. So in the end, you can get a 2-for-1 out of this card because you end up getting a fairly sizable token. But I still feel like the casting cost is high enough here that I have a hard time calling this premium. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Mirrodin Avenge, which for 1 black mana is a common instant. It says destroy target creature that was dealt damage this turn, draw a card. This is a functional reprint of You Are Already Dead, which we saw in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and that card was pretty underwhelming. When it worked, you got a pretty sweet 2-for-1, but it can never be that amazing because there aren't enough situations where you can do damage to something without already having to give up a card. In Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, you could attack with things and threaten to like ninjutsu things, so your opponent was more likely to block in situations. So I think in this format, this might just be even worse. Although perhaps with the presence of battles, it may mean that your opponent is more likely to block in this format too. But overall, I don't see this making the cut most of the time. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Nezumi Freewheeler, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 rat samurai at uncommon with menace. When it enters the battlefield, each player mills 3 cards, and you can pay 5 generic and a white Phyrexian mana to transform it into Hideous Fleshwheeler, a 4/5 Phyrexian rat with menace. And when this creature transforms into Hideous Fleshwheeler, put target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. A 4-mana 3/3 menace that makes both players mill 3 cards would probably be a C in this format. You want to be milling people, especially in blue-black. There's enough cards that pay you off for it. And the base rate of a 4-mana 3/3 menace isn't terrible either. So it's pretty nice that this can transform into such a good creature. Because it mills you, there is a very, very good chance that you will be reanimating something small when it transforms. You can also reanimate from your opponent's graveyard, so that increases your chances even more. And a 4/5 Menace is a creature that is pretty much always something your opponent has to account for. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Nezumi Informant, which for 1 generic and a black is a 1/1 rat rogue at common. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent discards a card. I always kind of like ravenous rats-like creatures, and that is what this is. Adding to the board and taking an opposing card out of their hand can be pretty sweet. This isn't exactly something like Virus Beetle, which was probably the best version of that we've ever seen. That particular card was an artifact in a format where that really mattered, and it was in a format with lots of ninjas, so it was easier to abuse the enter the battlefield ability. The thing this will do in this format probably is come down early, make your opponent discard, and then provide some good sacrifice fodder so for all of those outlets that we've seen already in this video. And it ends up being good sacrifice fodder because it does give you a 1-for-1 up front, but it does have diminishing returns the longer the game goes on. Sometimes it's just a 2-mana 1/1 in the late game, and that's not great. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Phyrexian Gargantua, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a 4/4 Phyrexian horror at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. This is a nice reprint. It's basically 2 Phyrexian Ragers stapled together. It has the potential to be a 3-for-1, and the trade-off is that you play a fairly below-rate creature that also hurts you a little bit. Still, the first copy seems like a solid inclusion. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Pile On, which for 3 generic and a black is a rare instant with Convoke. Destroy target creature or planeswalker, Surveil 2. This is a great removal spell. 4 mana to destroy a creature or planeswalker, and Surveil 2 is premium already, so Convoke means sometimes you can cast this even when you're completely tapped out. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's Render Inert, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says remove up to 5 counters from target permanent, draw a card. This is pretty interesting. It's another card where how battles end up playing out will really determine how good it is. If you can consistently use this to defeat a battle, it's going to feel pretty amazing. You're going to get a 2-for-1 out of it. The problem I see with it is basically all of its other modes are pretty bad. I mean, you can use it to get rid of an incubator token in most cases, but going after a token isn't going to feel amazing even when this replaces itself, and there are a few other little things you can do with counters in the set, but basically it's all in on defeating battles, and if it can't do that, it's going to feel like a pretty bad card. I mean, it does replace itself, but it does cost 3, so just like targeting a random permanent just to draw the card, especially at sorcery speed, like all of that just doesn't seem that good to me. I think I would be inclined to give it an F in a lot of formats, but the battle upside is just so hard to predict that I think I want to give it a D. Next up, it's Scornblade Berserker, which costs 1 black mana for a 0/1 human berserker at uncommon. It has backup 1, and you can pay 1 generic and sack it to draw a card. This is either a 1 mana 1/2 with this ability, or a 1 mana 0/1 that puts a counter somewhere and gives the ability to something else. I think with this particular card, you're frequently going to want to put the counter on something else, but then you're also not going to use the ability. You're just getting the counter out of Scornblade Berserker, and then planning down the line, or maybe on the same turn, to sacrifice Scornblade Berserker. Sometimes you will be able to put the counter on something that's also expendable, and then you can use this to sack 2 different creatures to draw a card, but I think the times where it performs the best are going to be where you put a counter on something else, and then cash this in for a card. And when you're doing that, it's a 2-mana sorcery that puts a counter on something and draws you a card with way more upside than that, and that's a pretty good card overall. I think this is another 1-drop that just looks like it has so much value and so much going on that it's hard for it not to be pretty good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Sheoldred, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a 4/5 legendary Phyrexian Praetor at Mythic Rare. It's got Menace, and when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. You can pay 4 generic and a black to exile Sheoldred, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery, and only if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard. She transforms into a saga, the True Scriptures. Chapter 1 says, for each opponent, destroy up to 1 target creature or planeswalker that player controls. Chapter 2 says, each opponent discards 3 cards and mills 3 cards. And Chapter 3 says, put all creature cards from all graveyards onto the battlefield under your control, exile the True Scriptures, and return it to the battlefield. So this has really good base stats and a solid enter the battlefield ability. It does get worse in the later stages of the game, but it is upside on a creature that's already pretty solid. You do have to jump through some hoops to actually transform her, But I think as we've seen in this video, black has plenty of ways to mill both players. So having your opponent end up with 8 cards in their graveyard can just be something that happens incidentally, certainly by the time you play Sheoldred. And if you've drafted Sheoldred early, which you will, because as we'll see, I think you basically always are going to first pick her, you're going to value those cards even more. So I do think transforming her is doable. There will be times where you get her in a deck that just isn't good at transforming her at all, but you still end up with this very good baseline creature. And like with the other cards in the cycle, once you do transform her, it's pretty hard for you to lose. She does actually wait a little longer to have like a massive impact on the board than the others. Like Chapter 1 lets you kill a thing, and Chapter 2 doesn't actually do that much most of the time. So she is a little slower than the others, but obviously once you get to Chapter 3, the game is pretty much over. Overall, I think Sheoldred gets an A. Next, it's Tenured Oilcaster, which for 3 generic and a black is a Phyrexian wizard at common. It has Menace. It gets +3/+0 as long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, and when it attacks or blocks, each player mills a card. A 4-mana 2/4 Menace isn't that bad, so if you add in the fact it mills you and pays you off for milling, it seems pretty nice. The times when this is a 5/4 Menace for 4 will feel pretty good too, giving this a C. Next, it's Traumatic Revelation, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery. It says, target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a creature or battle card from it. If you do, that player discards that card. If you don't, incubate 3. This looks like a solid discard spell for limited, and that is not something I say very often. Hitting creatures and battles means you can hit most non-lands in your opponent's deck, and if you whiff, you sort of end up with a hill giant, and obviously that's not awesome, but it does hedge against the main problem that discard spells have. They're incredibly weak when you whiff. If you go down a card and don't hit anything, it is the worst feeling in the world, and in the later stages of the game, you're increasingly likely to whiff. So getting this consolation prize helps soften how bad this card can be in the late game, and it still has the decent upside that discard spells have. I think this is a C. Next, it's Unsealed and Necropolis, which for 2 generic and a black is a common instant. It says each player mills 3 cards, and you return up to 2 creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. Black usually gets a nice common that returns creatures from your graveyard to your hand, and this it might be one of the best versions of it we've ever seen. Milling 3 for both players gets you pretty close to making the reverse threshold requirement happen, and it also increases your chances of being able to get back 2 creatures. It's also an instant, which isn't something we often see on this type of card. This means you can use this, for example, on the end of your opponent's turn and completely alter the kind of turn you were going to have and the kind of turn they were probably prepared for. You don't usually want more than one of these because they are pretty bad in the early game, like casting this early instead of just having a 3-mana 3/3 in your hand isn't really what you want to do. But by the mid to late game, this starts being a card that can really pull you ahead. And I think you should value the first copy of this pretty highly, especially if you're in black-blue and you can get extra value out of the mill effect. I think this is a B-. Next, we move to our last black card, which is Vanquish the Weak. It costs 2 generic and a black for a common instant. Destroy target creature with power 3 or less. This is a reprint and a pretty solid removal spell. It can sometimes trade up, but more often than not, you break even on mana when you cast this or do a little worse. For me, that keeps it from being a premium level removal spell. Instead, it's, just solid, giving it a C+. So those are all the black cards in March of the Machine. Tomorrow, I'll be back with my thoughts on all the red cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on the parts of the set review that are already up, you can see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.